Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today is another background episode. We're taking a look at the principles of war as defined by the U.S. military. This is a list of general principles we can use to evaluate a given military action, as well as predict whether a plan of action may or may not be successful. Now, it's important to explain that this is not the only list out there called the Principles of War. Pretty much everybody who has ever written about military theory has come up with their own list of principles, and each country's military has its own list. But this list is the one I'm familiar with, so it's the one my channel uses. Maybe someday we'll take a look at other lists if I decide I want to nerd out that way. So, that's out of the way. What are we doing here today? Well, when we dig into historical battles from different periods, it makes sense to have a common framework we can use to measure the success or maybe just the soundness of each side's planning and action. The principles of war give us that framework, so today I'm going to present them in a way that hopefully helps you understand them. War and combat have changed quite a bit from one historic age to another. But being human, we love to wonder about the great generals and militaries through history and debate like a bunch of nerds who was really the greatest general or military unit. We love to ask questions like, could Alexander have defeated Hannibal? Could Julius Caesar have defeated Attila? Could Belisarius have defeated Saladin? Could Richard the Lionheart have defeated Subutai? Could Napoleon have defeated Rommel? We ask these questions all day. The simplest answer is to look at the technology available to each of the leaders' armies and say the later general would have won, and that's usually the right answer. But the principles give us a way to compare apples to apples and see whose skill was really superb and who maybe just got lucky. So we need an objective measurement, a way to compare the actions of one unit on one battlefield against the actions of a different unit on a different battlefield that's distant from the first in time or space or both. We need, in short, a set of universal principles that'll help us make sense of all the different shapes and characters this thing called battle might take. We need the principles of war. So enough with the teasing. What are the principles? You can see, I've got a list of them right here. There are 9 of them, and we recognize them with the acronym MOS. Mass. Your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. An army of 20,000 soldiers can defeat an army of 100,000. It has happened, if it understands exactly where and when to focus its efforts to exploit its adversary's fatal weakness. If our hypothetical 20,000 man army can mass 5,000 troops against the enemy commander's 500 man bodyguard and capture him while the rest of the 2 armies keep each other busy, they stand an excellent chance of victory. This, incidentally, was one of Alexander's favorite tactics. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. A soldier rushing toward his enemy has often already reached the point of no return in his own mind. For him, the way home is through the poor bastards in front of him. The soldier waiting for the charge, on the other hand, has a lot more time to think about what's about to happen. For him, home is probably behind, away from the crazy bastards running at him with sharp things. Much easier to just run away. This effect was well understood by military leaders before anybody ever came up with the word psychology. Robert E. Lee was particularly good at taking advantage of this effect. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. You've seen this happen 100 times in movies, where the surprising force waits just off screen for its adversary to get close enough to be overwhelmed by a sudden attack. It's a little harder for real-world forces since there's no such thing as off-screen in the real world, but the effect of a good surprise is often the same. This is pretty much the reason submarines exist. In a world where moving assets by sea is both unavoidable and critical, The ability to hit the enemy without exposing yourself to danger is a huge advantage. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. It may seem counterintuitive to some, but it's important to protect your forces to the extent you can. For one, excessive casualties, especially avoidable casualties, are bad for morale. An army that deserts or worse, mutinies is unlikely to find much in the way of military success. And a soldier who can't fight because the enemy surprised his unit is no longer available when you need to mass your forces against the decisive point. Yes, a commander needs to understand when to endure casualties, but a successful commander knows to protect his soldiers from surprise or ambush or attacks from the flanks or behind. Julius Caesar showed a talent for security when he learned an enemy force was on its way to relieve a fortress he had under siege. So he built a second wall behind his own army, forcing the enemy to besiege him just as he lay siege to his own enemy. Next one is maneuver. Your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. We've already established that in a toe-to-toe fight, the advantage often favors the offense. The way to take the offensive is by maneuver. It's important to understand that maneuver is more than just movement. It's movement with a specific military purpose, whether that's to find the enemy, figure out what he's up to, escape a bad position, or occupy a terrain feature that fits the way you want to fight. In general, the faster you can maneuver to accomplish your goal, the better your chances. Erwin Rommel was a master at maneuver, often demonstrating an uncanny ability for being in exactly the right place to give him the maximum advantage over his enemy, usually before they could possibly expect him to be there. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. The wild Hollywood melee is fun to watch, but it's rare for two armies to just run to the middle of a field and hammer away at each other until one side breaks and runs. Instead, it's important that every member of an army, or at minimum every commander, understand what they're supposed to accomplish and do the things that need to be done in order to get the job done. If that goal is to kill as many of the enemy as possible or to drive them off the field, well, most battles still won't look like a Hollywood melee. But if the fight degenerates into something like that because the soldiers don't know what they're supposed to be trying to accomplish, because they don't know the plan or the plan is unclear, well, high casualties and a hard fight is probably the best you can hope for. The Athenians at Marathon are a great example of objective. Every man in the army understood their aim was to drive the Persians back to their ships, and every action they took was laser focused, if you can forgive me for applying that metaphor to a battle that took place more than 2,000 years before lasers were invented, on doing exactly that. Unity of command. Every soldier on a battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. If two commanders disagree on where to fight, or whether to fight, or how to approach the enemy, how can their soldiers know whose orders to follow? Indecisiveness is more often fatal to an army than bad decisions. A bad decision executed violently might have a chance of success, whereas an army with conflicting objectives will have a hard time coordinating its efforts to achieve anything. There needs to be a clear structure in place, including who has the authority to override whose decisions, so every man in the army knows whose orders to follow. Dwight D. Eisenhower gives us an excellent example of unity of command from World War II. Having a single commander in charge of the entire European theater of operations meant a single ultimate source of orders for all the millions of soldiers working to bring down the Nazis. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. It's a truism in the military that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You can dial in every detail, drill your men, rehearse everything until they can execute it in their sleep, And as soon as bullets start flying, as soon as the enemy does something that's just a little bit different from what your soldiers imagined, your brilliant plan becomes about as useful as last week's shit paper. That's when simplicity becomes critical. Because if a scared, shitless 19-year-old who hasn't slept in 2 days can't remember what he's supposed to do, he's just going to do what the guys to his left and right are doing. And guess what? They're looking at him to try to remember what to do. The simpler their task, the more likely they'll do what you need them to do. This is true all the way up the chain of command. Napoleon Bonaparte was a master of simplicity. His standing order to his commanders, march to the sound of the guns, ensured that whatever else they were doing, his troops would always converge on the battlefield, where he could then decide how best to employ them. Finally, economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. In a nutshell, this is your ability to keep your options open. A unit in contact with the enemy is a unit with very few options. To stop fighting long enough to find a better way to attack, retreat, or maneuver is to invite him to do the same, either keeping up the pressure on you or repositioning to hit you in a more vulnerable spot. Better to keep as much of your force as possible out of contact as long as possible, so you have freedom to maneuver and attack your enemy somewhere else when you understand a little more about his capabilities and intentions. George Washington was very good at this, always keeping enough troops out of contact that he could do some damage, then disengage his main force and retreat in the face of a better trained and often numerically and technologically superior force. Okay, Scott, you might be saying, that's a nifty list. Why should I care? And does this mean you're going to get all analytical to try to make the least boring subject in the history of the world boring? Well, fair question. I sure hope not, because believe me, I don't want this to be boring either. If talking about battle becomes boring, I'll lose interest about the same time you do. So no boring analysis. Just a list of principles to hopefully give us enough general information to put Alexander the Great on more or less the same playing field as Cyrus the Great or Peter the Great. So how do we use these principles? Each time we talk about a battle, we're going to take a few minutes to apply the principles to what we know about what happened on the battlefield. We'll use the principles to give each side a grade, if you will, and if it works the way I hope, we'll be able to create a ranking of battles and leaders throughout history. Here's how I envision it working, using Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top as an example. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg is one of those battles I'm going to make sure we get to, because it's one of my favorites. But for today, I'm just going to give you the thumbnail sketch. No shit, there they were. It's July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War. Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is the commander of the 20th Maine, an infantry regiment assigned to guard the extreme end of the Union left flank on a hill called Little Round Top. He's got about 300 guys, where a full-strength regiment should have more like 1,000. He's short on ammo, and shortly after he gets his men in position, he's attacked by 2 Alabama regiments trying to get around his flank to the left. If they can knock him off the hill, they can roll up the entire Union line, which will leave Lee's army free to wreak havoc in Pennsylvania while the Confederates ask Lincoln for recognition and peace terms. There's a very good chance that if the 20th Maine can't hold Little Round Top, the Federals lose the Civil War and the Union stays broken. So, Chamberlain fights off 2 charges and manages to hold on to the hill. But now he has a whole nother problem. He's out of ammunition. The 20th Maine is literally in a situation where they have more enemies in front of them than they have bullets. And the Alabama boys are getting ready to charge again. They're exhausted and they've lost a lot of guys, but they know one more good charge is going to do it. A sane commander would have gotten his boys the hell off that hill and let the rebels have it. So, of course, Chamberlain ordered his guys to fix bayonets and charge. Yes, really. and they drove the Alabama regiments off the hill, and the next day the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the kind of battle that every military professional and historian studies, at least every American military professional and historian. Because not only is it a great example of how to fight a battle, it's just fucking awesome. But how do we evaluate it? Well, that's what the principles are for. Each principle is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. Usually we do this head-to-head, comparing what each commander did right and wrong and assigning each one a score. Today, to keep things simple, we're just going to evaluate Chamberlain. Mass. We've already given the definitions. I'm going to give them again. Your capability to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Chamberlain did an excellent job concentrating his combat power at the critical point of the battle. He gets a 5 out of 5. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. He fought the entire battle on the defensive, but when he perceived his enemy's weakness, their exhaustion, he attacked without hesitation, even though he was out of ammunition. It's a 4 out of 5. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. I'm not sure even he knew what he was going to do until shortly before he did it. Even more than a century and a half later, it's hard to imagine what it took to give the order to charge. He gets a 5 out of 5 on surprise. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. He protected his flank from the Confederate attack, but if his final charge hadn't worked, he was, to use a technical term, screwed. He gets a 2 out of 5 on this one. Maneuver. Your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. He fought from a static position until it came time to advance. A frontal assault is rarely the way to win a battle, but charging downhill against an enemy that thinks he's about to kick your ass worked for Chamberlain. 3 out of 5. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. Every man of his regiment knew they had to keep the Confederate forces from rolling up the Union flank, and they all knew they were the only unit available to prevent that from happening. 5 out of 5 on this one. Next is unity of command. Every soldier on a battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. By the time the 20th Maine got to Little Round Top, everybody knew Chamberlain was in command and trusted him to pull them through. I'm not sure the picture would have been as clear if he had been wounded or killed. So he gets a 4 out of 5 there. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Of course, this fight in particular shows that simple and easy are not the same thing. Their plan was simple. We stand here and fight until we can't anymore. But there can't be many things harder than to keep fighting when you're flat ass out of ammo. So he gets a 5 out of 5 for that one. And finally, economy of force. This is your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. He had a few men from the 2nd Maine to bolster his numbers, but other than that, he and his officers were his only reserve. In the final charge, he threw everything he had into the fight. It worked out for him, but if there had been another regiment waiting at the bottom of that hill, he would have been out of options. So Chamberlain's total score for Little Round Top is 34 out of 45. Since success in battle is always going to require trade-offs, I suspect this is pretty close to the highest score possible. If you're still here, I'm going to take that as a sign you're still interested. Check out our other videos where we look at some more battles in greater detail. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.